of the Centennial Committee. We have our last faculty lecture of the series for this year, and hopefully it's something that will continue. But last but not least, of course, is Johan Erikson. And just to give you some of his background degrees, he's actually a Mainer, which I think is pretty neat. He went to Gray and New Gloucester High School, Dartmouth undergraduate in geology and geophysics, Stanford MS in geology, Dartmouth PhD in geology, and postdoctorate at Cornell. That's not too bad, is it? He arrived here at St. Joe's in 2006, and he's up for tenure now. He's teaching environmental science and physics classes, plus Gulf of Maine environment by sea kayak, whatever, yeah. In the Mason. It's been a long day, I can tell you. I've had the pleasure of working with Johan on a couple of different committees, and I've always been very amazed by his strategy and his ability to clarify and actually work with some very difficult people, so it's been great. Just to mention some of his field work, because that's what you're going to be seeing tonight. His projects have been in the Caribbean, Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, and Italy. Maybe we should all change our major. He's had research positions at UC Davis and the Appalachian Mountain Club, more than a dozen peer-reviewed research publications, including a rather large one last month, $50,000 in grant for geology research in Maine. And I know this is not what he's talking about today, but he's very excited about a snow chemistry research project that he's doing with the U.S. Forest Service and some of our students on Mount Washington, checking out, I lost it. He's checking out, what is
Acid snow.
Acid snow, thank you. That's what it is. Mm-hmm. But tonight, Johan will tell you the secrets of how mountain ranges grow, using his experience and photos from the Andes Mountains of Venezuela. So please welcome Johan.
Well, thank you, Mary Lynn. Yes, I'm going to make it dark here, so not so that you can discreetly fall asleep, but because I'll have a number of photos, and I want it dark enough so you can actually see the photos. So yes, there's no geology major at St. Joe's, so rather than give a super detailed talk on the intricacies of mountain building processes, partly what I'm going to do is the following. What you'll see is a bunch of scenery from the Andes of Venezuela and the lowlands. There'll be a bit of mountain building processes, and then some discussion on how we can figure out 10 million years of mountain range history. So a bit of process, an investigative process. Just in case you don't know where we are. So in this picture here, the equator runs down here on the bottom. So this is northern South America. And so we're up in Venezuela, and the Andes in Venezuela are right here. And so I'll be working on discussing this area right here, and I'll zoom in on that. Sort of zoom in. So this, for scale, each box here is about 140 miles in each direction. What we can see here is some of the elevations to give you a perspective. So it's fairly long range, but it's pretty narrow, much narrower than, say, the Rockies. But the elevations involved are much higher than the Rockies. The numbers here, you can see by color coding, all this is really low-level elevation, almost really flat. Well, this is essentially sea level. For comparison, this is in meters, but for comparison, Mount Washington is just below 2,000 meters tall. So Mount Washington would be about in this range, so the upper part of the red. But the elevations of the peaks get quite a bit higher. In fact, the highest peaks in Venezuela in this zone where I'll be showing is over 5,000 meters. So that's over 16,000 feet. And yet the range is narrower than the Rockies. So since it's narrower but taller, the slopes are quite a bit steeper than what you'd see in the Rockies. Okay. Also for reference, you might want to know, let's see, so it's running this way, but on this northwest side, we have the Maracaibo Basin, which you've benefited from, I suppose, indirectly, because about a quarter a quarter of the oil imports to the U.S. come from right in this zone right here. So this is Venezuela is part of OPEC. And so most of our, like I said, about a quarter of our oil imports come from right here. Okay? There's much less known on this side. So that's well. I'll be zooming in to some of this. And since right, so momentary escape. And then we go to this. And so we have, so right here, this is a Google Earth image of this area. Notice you'll still recognize Lake Maracaibo. The range is harder to see in this, but the range is pretty much right through here. And what I'm going to do is give you some idea of the elevations involved and what it looks like. So I'm going to go run along these white lines. So first we'll do this one over here, and we will show an elevation profile. So this is what it looks like. As you go across the mountain range from off here in the southeast, see it's really low elevation. It's only about 400 feet tall, and yet it's about 1,000 miles away from the ocean. There's a tall ridge. As you run up through here, there's a tall ridge all the way through. And again, this is where it gets up to about 5,000 meters tall. And there's a deep valley. Still, that's so that the bottom of the valley here is about the same elevation as the top of Mount Washington. And then it runs up again, almost as high again, up to about 14,000 feet there. And then all the way back down to the lake and very flat land down there. Okay, so what does that look like in terms of what you might see? Oh, skipped a little bit ahead of myself. There we go. Okay, so now this is going to the southeast. And so here we're on the flatlands. On the flatlands of the lake. It's really flat, almost right at sea level. And you'll notice in the color changes right about here, and that color change is primarily because they do a lot of burning, so this is probably smoke. And then we get up to the foot of the mountains, and the mountains rise up really fast. There's probably, well, actually we know that there are quite a few faults right through here, and these mountains are getting shoved up over this flatland. And the white here is not snow, it's actually clouds. I mean, these are satellite photos, and so these are clouds, not snow. But notice the ravines that are all through here. These ravines drain the upper land. There's a lot of rain that falls in this area, so you get really deep erosion. And by now we're already up to about 8,000 feet. And notice we go from green of vegetation to the brown. I get above tree line. And devoid of vegetation, and just lakes up there. We get into I'm going to go faster. We'll get into the valley in between. So this drops, there's actually a good-sized city here. And then we head up to the next range. And once again, you go from green, deep ravines, and we get up to the highest peak in here. This is about 16,000 feet. And more ravines. Now we're getting over on the eastern side, the southeast side, and we drop into the flatlands. And pretty much you get to the edge of the mountains, and it goes flat. Okay. So do that. Okay, and that's pretty much what it looks like in cross-section. Now I need to get back out of this, and back into this. Okay, so forward now. So what causes mountain ranges to go up? That's what the mountain ranges look like, but what causes them to go up? And pretty much all big mountain ranges are pushed upward by horizontal compression. So there's squishing from the sides. As they squish from the sides, whether they be plates or platelets, squish from the sides, and material has to get shoved up. And it's not oozing upwards. It's usually by shoving one side or another upwards. So it's usually by horizontal compression. And that applies to all of these big ranges here. But what happens to the core of the range as the range is compressed? Well, as the core is squeezed, as you squeeze from the sides, faulting occurs, and that faulting could be on just one side, which is typical for, say, the Rockies, where Denver is, there's really only faulting on one side of the Rockies there, or faulting could be on both sides. So that needs to be determined. So in this case, I don't figure this out. This has already been determined. So this is these are two cross sections for the mountain range. So this would have been the northwest side. This is the southeast side. So that's essentially along the profile that I just showed you in Google Earth. And what we've got here, the colors, I don't need to give you ages, but the colors basically are correlated. So we've got squeezing from left to right. And as this area was squeezed up, this is where we see that there's faulting on this side. This area has been shoved over this. These are much younger rocks here in green and orange and yellow. They're underneath this really old rock. I'd said that it could be on one side or both sides. Well, what we've got, of course, is messy. Well, it seems like it's mostly getting shoved up over this side. And, well, also there's a little bit of shoving up over on this side. So we've got a little bit of both. And most of the photos you'll see later on are from right over in here. And we'll get to that later. So we got a case where, yeah, it's mostly one side, but a little bit on both. Okay. What else happens to the core of the range as it's compressed? Well, as the core goes up, as it's getting shoved up, erosion eats away wherever there are steep slopes and or lots of rain and snow. So this is where we get into some photos. So what I'm going to do is essentially run from high up on the range here and work our way down to the lowlands. So I'm going to start up high and work my way down and show you what happens to the mountain range. So this is up at about 15,000 feet, and sure enough, we're up high, steep slopes, and we've got snow. I know it's the tropics, but there are glaciers, and it's winter up there almost all the time. And steep slopes, which means that because of the steep slopes, you get boulders moving. Big rocks move when they're steep slopes. If the slopes are really shallow and flat, big rocks don't move; they just sit still. So the steeper the slopes, the bigger the rocks that move. So up here, yeah, you get big rock fall, and then you move down in elevation. Here, this is still at about 14,000 feet, and we still got small glaciers. Certainly no vegetation yet. This is the dry season. This is down at about 13,000 feet. I spent 2 nights here at this pond and climbed up through here. For those that have had geology, you'll recognize that this is a U-shaped valley associated with a glacier. This glacier up here is curling up around the corner, but just a couple hundred years ago, that glacier was all the way down here into the pond, into the tarn. What else do we have? Down here at about 11,000 feet, we're starting to get some vegetation. Slopes are flattening a little bit. And I pointed out that this photo is looking south. Up here, we're above the clouds. Notice all the clouds here. This is the clouds that were over the Maracaibo Basin. And under those clouds, it's wet a lot of the time. So up here, you actually get a lot of the Venezuelans will come up to this area just to get out of the rain. So they'll come up and have picnics and all, but it's fairly cool up there. And sure enough, here, this is actually a national park. This peak is still at over 15,000 feet. The waterfalls and such. And the vegetation, we're not into trees yet. These are phrylohones, so these mostly survive off of cloud dew. And further down, you get some vegetation. I had a visitor. So in this elevation here, we're down probably about 11,000 feet or 10,000 feet. We're starting to get more vegetation, but it's still chilly. Finally, people start showing up. Not a whole lot of people in geology talks, but yes, so now we get people showing up because now we're down in the range of agriculture. And sure enough, here we see we're now down by about 9,000 feet or so. Now you start to get farms and such. Well, continuing back on. So what happens back to the core? What happens to the core of the range that's compressed? Well, the rising core brings older rocks upwards, and those older rocks are warm because they've been deeper in the earth. So as it brings older, warm rocks to the surface, those older rocks cool off as they get closer to the surface, and that will be important later on. in this photo, this is still the mountain range here. Notice it's still oriented up this way. The colors are not terribly important for this talk, but they're color-coded by age. And these colors down here are the old rocks, and they're about 300 million years old. And the yellows and such get up to 30, 20, and about 1 million years old. So what you see here, the point here is that notice that all right here in the middle, which is where the highest elevations are, we have the oldest rocks where the highest elevations are. And so these are 300 million year old rocks brought to the surface. And as you get to lower elevation this way and lower elevation that way, we get younger and younger rocks. So the whole middle of the range is bowing up, and we're bringing up old rocks in the middle. Okay. So my next series of photos are going to be in this side down in here where we get into young rocks off here on the flanks of the mountain. Okay. So what happens to the flanks of a range? Well, as mountains go up, boulders and sand and silt that are eroded from the rising mountain range, they're transported away by rain and such, and rivers, and they accumulate off on the flanks where the flowing water can slow down. They accumulate in rivers and lakes and floodplains as it spreads out away from the mountain range. And the continuing compression causes the flanks to actually grow outward by faulting, which then re-exposes some of the older sediments. And I'll show you, here's a little sandbox experiment of how that works. So I'll explain this little experiment here. So this is a sandbox. These are layers of colored sand, and they're simulating horizontal rock layers. And what we've got over here, this whole side's going to just get pushed this direction. So we're looking at off on the flanks of the mountain range, and the core of the mountain range is off here on the right. So this is going to shove that way. Well, as it shoves that way, we get the material here on the edge starts getting pushed up. It getting pushed up, and there's faulting occurring through there. Okay? That process continues. And as it continues, as this stuff gets pushed up, there's erosion starts to occur here, and now we get a blue layer. That might be a lake sediment or maybe an inland sea. So there's new young sediment there. We continue to get faulting. So this area off here on the flank of the mountain range is growing both taller and wider as we get continued compression. And it continues more and more fault systems through there. Process continues. Some of the faults are really big, like here. Others are really small. But you can see little ones that start here eventually become bigger faults as there's continued progression. The whole thing steps outwards, and now we've got new ones forming further out in the basin. The whole thing steps outward. And what's happening also is we have these younger blue sediments are getting trapped underneath this fault system. So we end up with this mixture of old, going to young, back to old, back to young, back to old, going back and forth through the stack. And as you can see, it continues on. Eventually, we get faults going all the way out here. So remember, this is just off on one flank. The core of the mountain range would be right in this zone here. Well, this occurs on both sides of the mountain range. And what we get here is, in this sort of scenario, this is zoom in, and what we get is a case of, notice that there are some of this older sediment, which is these brown layers. They end up getting exposed on the surface, and then that stuff can then get recycled and then show up again. It can actually flow down here and then get trapped underneath this fault all over again, so we can recycle some of this stuff. Young sediments end up getting buried, and partly can get recycled. What's not in this simulation were all those ravines and gullies that I showed you on the Google Earth. Okay? We're not seeing all those gullies through here, so that's not simulated in this. Okay? But what you see on the ground, this is essentially what's part of that flank, where you get all those stacks of sediments. Big ravines cutting through here. It's covered in vegetation. It's kind of hard to work here. But as a geologist, I get in here and look at these kind of cuts. There are farmers' fields up in here. Typical geologist, we look at a situation like this, it's like, oh, vegetation. You can't see much because of all the darn vegetation. So what we end up doing is we're going for road cuts where we can actually see the rock, or we end up climbing up the river valleys, because that's where there's usually exposure. I don't spend much time up in this area because you can't see anything. So, and it's hazy because we're probably in the dry season, and once the dry season starts, they start burning the fields, and so that's probably smoke. This particular image, this is almost all the way down to the toe, and actually the mountain range continues up here, and it's really flattening out here. This area has been already faulted some. This is not completely out on the flat area. All of these areas have all been tilted. All of this is tilted over, so there are faults going underneath all of this. And as you can see, we're not up in the glacier zone anymore. Now we're in the palm trees and such. So this is where I spent a lot of my time. Once again, it's smoky because it's the dry season. There's a river flowing through here, and it's the rivers where we can really get a good look at the older sediments that are in that stack of flank sediments. So most of my time was spent in a creek that runs up here like this. Okay. So this is what the creek looks like. This is not me. That's one of my coworkers. We tend to go in the dry season because at this latitude, there's very much a wet season and a dry season. The dry season running December, January, February, March. If we were to come back in June, July, and August, the water would be well up into the trees. So impossible to work in the wet season. And by the time you get all the way out, remember where it got really flat as you get away from the mountain range. By the time it gets really flat, as you can see, there's not a whole lot to look at out there. By the time it gets really flat, because the slope is low, the speed of the water is low, so therefore the big particles can't get moved. So therefore, notice here in this river section, it's all nice uniform sand, because that's all that can get transported by the water. So by the time you get to this kind of a river, it's all sand. So how do we solve the problem of how to figure out how the mountain formed? Well, complex problems usually require multiple methods to capture all sorts of different types of information. Complex problems usually require a team of skilled scientists with a variety of specialists. So I had to assemble a team. So there's our team. Typical field work, we're in muddy river sediments, and in this case, Pete was working in the field, but he eventually did some specialist work on identifying sandstone populations. Hannah was an undergrad at Smith, and now she's a veterinarian in Arizona. But she wrote me and said, "Oh, but I still love paleontology." So apparently she's got a 3-year-old now that's already trying to learn how to identify fossils. But so that's part of our skilled team. Our team included me interpreting environments and then putting the whole thing together. We had a prof that was doing thermal modeling, which I'll show you later. We had another professor doing magnetic polarity dating. It didn't work. And Pete, and then I had 2 undergrads and a college buddy who were helping me with field work. So Pete, one of the methods that was used with sandstone populations. This is how we go about figuring out stuff. So in sand, there's dark grains and light-colored grains, and there's lots of different species in there, species of grains. There's quartz, which you've heard of, plagioclase and feldspar and micas and chert and several igneous species, igneous being coming out of volcanoes and such, and lots of scarce species. How we interpret that is, this is off on the flanking sediments, not up in the core of the mountain range, but on the flanking sediments, when we collect a sandstone, and if it's all quartz, that's going to tell us that the area from which the sand came had nothing but sedimentary rock there. It was all sedimentary rock, and then we eroded it and transported and accumulated nothing but quartz. So we can tell what was eroded from the core of the mountain range if it's all quartz. If there's more K-spar and micas, that tells us there was deeper erosion, and we're starting to erode metamorphic rocks. If we start getting igneous species of grains, we tell us that there are granite-like rocks getting exposed from the middle of the mountain range. So how does this look? A bit fuzzy, but these are we take rocks and we cut them into thin wafers and we put them under a microscope, and that's how we identify the species. But these are almost all quartz. There's a little bit of chert here. This is all quartz. a little bit of chert, but it's mostly quartz. So this is low down in the section. Higher up in the section, we get big K-spar grains. There's some biotite, there's some mica, and there's some more mica. So the population changes, and from that we can interpret what was eroded from the mountain range. What does it look like when we present data? You know, we plot it up. Quartz and plagioclase and feldspar, and we see trends that initially it was all quartz, and then over time it became more and more and more K-spar rich. You know, here it's all quartz and feldspar and rock fragments. It started out as all quartz, and it basically changed over time, and that's telling us that it started out as eroding sedimentary rock, but over time it was eroding more and more metamorphic and igneous rocks. And then there are cases where you say, wait a minute, something doesn't look right. This is one rock. This is one pebble. So where we are, we're down in the lower lands. It's like, how does a rock this big get transported down here? Well, basically things happen. There was a period about 1 million years ago where the mountains were even taller than they are now, and the gullies were less deep, and there were big rocks coming down associated with earthquakes and such, coming down from the highlands, such that even bigger rocks then than now. What else do? We look at sedimentary environments, mostly trying to distinguish between different types of river deposits, and lake deposits, and ocean deposits. And we use things like ripples and channels and root traces and such to determine the energy of the transporting water. And then sometimes we can use things like color to figure out the aerobic conditions in the sediments. So what's that look like? So here's a burrow. This is about an 8 million year old burrow in the sand. Here we've got a case of This is layers of sand and mud, and there's a channel right here. And from that we can start to figure out what this area looked like 8 to 10 million years ago. Here's layering. These are lake sediments. These are 8 or 9 million year old lake sediments. And this area up here, you notice this one's darker. This case is, most of us have gotten in lakes where the bottom of a lake is all stinky. You don't want to put your feet down because it smells bad and all. This is just that sort of stuff. This is now 10 million year old stinky mud. It's so rich in organic matter, this produces oil. This has got an oil smell to it. More lake sediments are ripples here. So we can tell it's a lake sediment because these kinds of ripples are only associated with wave motion. They're not associated with currents, but associated with waves, so we can figure out it's a lake. Colors. We've got cases here. This is probably boggy marsh kind of stuff based on the purpley color, a little more oxidized stuff we look for. Big packages of sediment, big package. And notice the repeating cycles, so you probably had flood events. It ends up on charts like this, and from this we can interpret that there were lakes and alluvial fans. I'm not going to go into that. Okay, more interesting, thermal modeling of fission tracks in apatite. So apatite's a mineral, and the apatite commonly includes lots of impurities. And one of those impurities that it regularly includes is uranium. Well, the uranium undergoes radioactive, so it's radioactive. It undergoes fission. The fissioning uranium atoms, we know that in these crystals, they produce explosion tracks that are 14 microns long. So that's 14 millionths of a meter long, predictably, because the energy associated with the fissioning is pretty predictable. Well, the number of tracks can then be used to determine the age of the crystal, because the number of tracks tells you how many uranium atoms have undergone fission. But there are complications, of course. So this is what apatite looks like. This would be a fine sand grain size. It's a clear mineral, and all of these are not little needles in there. These are actually little explosion tracks. These are hollow tubes on the inside of the mineral. And as you can see, this is a 20 micron bar, and sure enough, almost all of these are 14 microns long. Okay, so the number of tracks is related to the amount of uranium that's undergone fission. Well, the complication being that in warm apatite, at about 100 degrees C, the tracks start to anneal. They start to fix themselves. And same way you would have wax if you put a cut in wax and you heated up the wax, that cut would slowly fix itself. Well, as the warm apatite anneals, you end up with shorter and shorter tracks as the crystal structure repairs itself. Consequently, if you measure both the number of tracks and their lengths, you can figure out a temperature history for a group of minerals. Well, that's pretty powerful. What's that look like? It looks like this. So let me explain this graph. So on the bottom here, I have time in millions of years, 25 million years ago to the present, and temperature. So this is 200 degrees. This is Celsius, 200 degrees Celsius, up to about room temperature up here. So what this says, based on the work we did, was that for our set of crystals, they were at 170, probably 170, 180 degrees for this long time period. They were hot. These crystals were hot in their granite host up in the mountain range. And then eventually, starting about here, about 15 million years ago, the whole mountain range started to go up. Well, at least these crystals that were in the mountain range started to go up. And as they go up, they were cooling. As they're cooling, eventually they came all the way to the surface. So they were at the top of the mountain range. They were eroded from the top of the mountain range, transported down rivers, buried off in the flanks of the mountain range. This is where they're buried, and as they get buried deeper and deeper and deeper, so they start warming up again. As they start warming up again, and then once again, some of that gets pushed back up, so they've been pushed back up, and now they're up to the surface here now. So they're at the surface now, but they've had this complex history of cooling, getting reburied, and getting uplifted again. So we can constrain the time when they were at the surface at about 9.5 million years ago. So putting it all together. So this is what the conclusion section on a research paper. Put it all together. So 14 to 15 million years ago, before the compression occurred, that we had sedimentary. These are sedimentary rocks up on top of the mountain range. You get some squishing going on. The middle of the mountain range starts to pop up, and so you get erosion from this area, and it starts to accumulate over here on the sides. This is where we're getting all that quartzy stuff. Process continues. 9 million years ago, it's starting to pop up even more, starting to shove out over the sides. So this area is going up. More erosion. We're getting down to metamorphic rocks. You get to about 2 million years ago, it's really shoved out over the edge. Here it's pushing this down, more and more erosion, more shoving up here. It's more compression and more uplift over there, recycling. So we end up with now back to, this is what it was about 2 million years ago, and this is what it is now. So sort of backtracking, creating that history. So you go through all this process. What you're supposed to do, you're supposed to then write it up, publish it, so that not only that you figure out stuff, but that you communicate those results to other people. That's the end result. And then, okay, so we've done all that. Now that I've been through that process, what's next? Well, I'm applying that same team-type approach to my current research, which Mary Lynn explained or mentioned, on alpine snow chemistry up on Mount Washington with the assistance of St. Joe's students. And St. Joe's newest generation will benefit, of environmental science and marine science majors, will benefit from more education in the field, which I happen to like, as we roll out an entire semester of off-campus field-based courses in fall 2014. So that's the future, and thanks for coming. So I teach physics in addition to this sort of stuff, and one of the things we talk about in physics is velocity and speeds and accelerations. So that's usually in meters per second. But here we're looking at millions of years per minute. So yeah, I got about 15 million years in 30 minutes. Yeah. Okay. Any questions? Yeah, Robert.
Did you have any problem with altitude sickness?
Well, when I went up to the higher parts, where I went up to about 14, 15, almost 15,000 feet, I mentioned that I spent 2 nights at that one lake, and certainly that getting up to that lake, which was about 12.5, 13,000 feet, the first night there, didn't sleep hardly at all. I mean, through the entire night, I checked my pulse in the middle of the night because I wasn't sleeping much. Through the middle of the night, my heart was running along at 110, 120. Hard to sleep at that point. So no sickness, but certainly feeling the effects of the altitude. Spent 24 hours at that same elevation, and then the next night at the same spot, heart rate came down, actually got some sleep. So no, I never suffered any sickness, but it makes a big difference whether you hike up to that elevation or, as my wife and I did once we were down there, they have a huge, almost like gondola system that goes up 10,000 feet. And when you do that, then you get altitude sickness, yeah. But no, hiking up, no, I never got altitude sickness. Anybody else? Yeah, Bill.
I read a report fairly recently claiming that the Colorado River may be 10 times older than we thought it was. Does that have any reflection on your dating here? Now they say 60 million. Recently thought it was 9, 10 million. Now they say 60 million.
Yeah. How they're going to date the age of a river? A single river, the Colorado River, for instance, has to cut its way through the entire Colorado Plateau. And that process, you can date that. As the river formed, it would have transported sediments and deposited them somewhere in the system. And if they date those sediments, they can constrain how old a river system is. But depending on where you sample, you can't necessarily tell whether the samples are collected from the river that's there presently, or if there was a different river system that was depositing at that location, and now, because of headward erosion and all, stream capture and all, you might have a different river system depositing in the same area today. So the dating techniques, I'm sure, are valid, but how you ascribe the origin of the sediments, that could be argued from situation to situation. Somebody else? Yeah.
Son, if we see a big rock here in the middle of the field, we assume that it was dropped by a glacier,
Yeah.
or left by a glacier.
Yeah.
How do you know that isn't the case with that big rock in the fall?
Right. So Dr. Mitchell is referring to all the big stones around campus, the big gorgeous stones that are around. Okay. Those have all been transported and deposited as drop stones out of glaciers. They're erratics. So this area was covered by a glacier during the last ice age, and there were big, huge boulders trapped in the ice. And then the ice melts, it just leaves the boulder behind. Okay? That's common for around here. Here we've got what's called till. Okay? In Venezuela there's no evidence of a till anywhere below about 9,000 feet or so. You don't have any of the erosive features, any of the U-shaped valleys, anything that would indicate that glaciers at any time extended below about 9,000 feet. And there's nothing, for instance, in my area that had evidence of glaciers. You have a big rock, and what's happened, and so the counter interpretation would be that at one point the mountains were taller, the valleys were not quite so deeply incised as they are now, so therefore we had a more uniform apron of sediment coming down from the mountain range. And if the mountain range was even steeper than it is now, with big earthquakes, you would have been able to transport larger materials down a slope. So not glacial, because other than the big rock, there's no evidence whatsoever, any evidence beyond just a big rock for glaciers.
Another question I had was, you're dating the appetite by the number of fission tracks
Right.
there are. How do you know that the amount of uranium was the same in all your samples?
Well, I didn't explain all that, but for each crystal, there was a separate determination process to figure out the original amount of uranium within each crystal. So what's done is, not only do you count the tracks, but after the tracks are counted, then the samples are bombarded so that you can stimulate fission. The same crystals are then bombarded so that you can determine the total amount of uranium that's in the sample. So I didn't explain that part, but yes. Yes, Gene. Yeah.
Thank you. So I really thought that Sandbox demo was really valuable for understanding
Yeah.
Your talk. And I was just curious, was that something you just pulled off the web, or are those photos you took?
No, I did not do those. I
Yeah.
didn't give a citation either. No, it was a professor at Union College. One of his classes did that, a geology class, and they put that together as part of a class, and I pulled that off the web and then just did screenshots of their YouTube video. And so they didn't quite do it all. They used a vacuum cleaner to simulate erosion, so they sucked off sand grains as opposed to having water, incised gullies and stuff. But yeah, I pulled that. Yeah, that was nice. Really?
I was curious, when you were there, you were seeing everything up close and personal.
Yeah.
When you went onto Google with the satellite, you saw these huge areas, which was a very different perspective.
Yeah.
What did you learn from the difference?
Well, certainly as you could tell by the amount and color of my hair from the photos, I did some of that work a while ago. So at that time there wasn't Google Earth, but we did have topo maps, certainly, and certainly one of the helpful skills as a geologist is being able to really visualize things well on topo maps. So even though, yes, there were satellite photos, but that didn't give you elevation. So mostly it was working off topo maps, and so I had pretty good sense for topographic relief and such, simply based on, and also spent a lot of time there, so you get an idea of where the valleys are, but primarily from the really detailed topo maps. Yeah, Brian.
Does the age of the Andes vary a lot when you go north to south?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, a whole lot.
Much older down south?
Well, the early parts of the Andes, it goes way back. There are different building periods, different time periods when they were certainly coastal range. There was a coastal range, like there is on a lot of coasts, but they really built up when it turns out that South America accelerated across in the mantle reference frame. But and so they really started popping up primarily in Peru and Argentina and Bolivia area. They really started popping up. I don't know, when did that be? Sometime Eocene, Oligocene, so maybe 30, 40 million years ago, and it varies along the location. So in Venezuela, they're a much later event. Much later event. Yep.
Is there a connection between the earthquake that we had this morning and the type of process that you're talking about in the Andes?
The difference is there was another small earthquake this morning. The difference being that, the earthquakes, what I showed, especially where I showed in the Sandbox experiment, that was all compression. And so that's going to lead to faults where there's one section getting pushed up over another. Those are called thrust faults, and those usually lead to the really big earthquakes like the ones in Sumatra and Japan. Okay? Whereas what we have here in Maine are leftover creaking and groaning, just leftover creaking and groaning from the separation and opening up of the Atlantic starting 180 million, 160 million years ago when Europe and North America and Africa separated from each other. And when you separate these continents, you get some subsidence. And so what we have now are just leftover extension, rather than compression, leftover extension, creaking and groaning. So faulting and earthquakes, but pulling apart rather than getting compressed together. Yeah.
On that same vein, does that mean we'll never have a huge earthquake in Maine?
Probably not, but defining never, to a geologist. Yeah. No, we're not likely to have really, really big ones. In terms of, yes, we might have. There was the U.S. Geological Survey, based on historical descriptions of damage from the 17 and 1600s. There were some evidence in Massachusetts of an earthquake on the order of like a 5.0 or 6.0. So like every couple hundred years, you could get something like a 6.0 earthquake. You're not going to see a 7. The scale's logarithmic, so each time you go up by a number, it goes up by tenfold. So it's probable that we're going to see in this region, probably not in Maine because of the way the faults work, but but maybe down in Massachusetts and farther down the coast in New Jersey and all, you might get a 6.0 or a 5.5 every 300 to 400 years. You probably missed that one. Yeah, Camille.
I'm curious about what questions you're on Mount Washington with the student research.
Oh, okay. So the student research is looking at two things. One is it's looking at how the concentration of acid in the snow, how it varies with elevation. Because for the people doing more ecological research, you know, how plants are responding to climate change and pollution, it's important to know, it's important not to assume that the deposition of acid is the same everywhere. And what we're seeing in the snow research so far, because we've done it 3-4 winters already, is that the concentration of the amount of acid that's in the snow triples or quadruples as we go from like Pinkham Notch or Crawford Notch, you know, at about 2,000 feet. As we go up to about 4,000 feet, the total amount of acid that's in the snow almost triples. So we're seeing differences in elevation, but we're also seeing slight differences as you go from the windward western side to the leeward eastern side. So you're getting more acid deposited on the western side than on the eastern side. And so that's one of the biggest things that we're looking at, because that acid then, when the snow melts, typically the snow melt tends to be in a pretty short period in March and April, and that's so basically there's this whole flush of acid coming out pretty much in a really short period of time. And so what I'm trying to do is quantify how much acid's there for somebody else then to figure out how it's going to affect the biological systems. But we need to try and constrain how much acid's really in that snowpack.
Why do you think the acid varies that much by altitude?
Well, we know that it turns out that the distribution of acid within clouds is not uniform. So it turns out acids tend to hang out at the bottom of clouds. So it turns out where the highest acid concentrations occur is right where the clouds essentially hit and intersect the mountain range. So it turns out, it seems that actually acid concentrations climb as you go up in elevation, and the typical, as most of us know, Mount Washington is typically surrounded in clouds. So acid concentration tends to climb up to about the average base of the cloud elevation, and then once you get into the clouds, it seems like the increase stops. It kind of stabilizes. So during the rain that's coming down, or snow that's coming down through the winter, it's falling through the clouds, picking up an average amount of acid as it's getting dropped. But as it gets pressed up against the mountain, you get orographic uplift, you get more condensation, and you're also getting closer to that really concentrated layer of acid within the clouds. And so you also tend to get more precipitation as you go up in elevation, because the clouds are going up and it's cooling off and you get more rain. Yeah. And some of you, a couple of you, have actually gone up on Mount Washington with me in the winter. So I'm always looking for more bodies that want to go up on Mount Washington in the winter. Okay. I guess that's it.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Johan. We'd like to give you this.
Oh, okay, thanks.